Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Senator Lauren Legarda, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to the Bridges Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. I'm Professor June Borromeo, and I will be your host and moderator for this afternoon. May I call on AIM President Francis Estrada to deliver the welcome remarks.
Senator Lauren Legarda, Bangko Sentral Governor Amado Tatanco, AIM Chairman Joey Quisio, International Peace Foundation Chairman Uwe Morawetz, former AIM President Roberto de Ocampo, members of the diplomatic community, distinguished guests, friends of the Asian Institute of Management, welcome. Despite the turbulence that we have witnessed towards the end of 2007, we had a good year in Asia. The Asian Development Bank expects the region to report a 2007 growth rate of a very respectable 8.3%. The unprecedented losses reported by the world's leading financial institutions arising from the subprime mortgage crisis, massive unauthorized trading losses at a major European bank, and the secular decline in the value of the US dollar have, however, shaken confidence in the international financial system. Exacerbating these concerns are rumblings of an American or US consumer credit crisis, continuing high oil prices, an unsettled Middle East, and escalating turmoil in Africa. How is this all likely to affect Asia, the world's most populous and fastest growing region, factory to the world, and holder of 2/3 of the international global reserves? Has the much referred to decoupling of world economy from that of the US evolved to a point where it will actually cushion the impact of contracting US demand? How does that work in a rapidly globalizing economy? These are difficult questions indeed. But in this context, we are privileged today to welcome Professor Finn Kydland, distinguished Nobel laureate for economics, to share his wisdom with us. Most appropriately, he will speak to us on peace and economic development in the age of globalization. Now a pause for a sponsor, as it were. AIM was established 40 years ago this year to develop managers and leaders for Asia. Over 34,000 participants from 70 countries completed its various programs to date. Not surprisingly, the Institute is a committed advocate to regional economic integration and constructive engagement with the global economy. Professor Kydland's talk to us today follows similar addresses made, among others, by Mr. Pascal Lamy, Director General of the World Trade Organization, Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister, Russian Foreign Minister, fellow Nobel Prize laureate Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, and ADB President Haruhiko Kuroda, among others. AIM congratulates the International Peace Foundation for conceiving of the Bridges Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace program. The idea of promoting relationships between global thought leaders committed to peace and Asian educational institutions and their respective communities is truly special. On behalf of the Asian Institute of Management, thank you all for joining us in what I am sure will be a most enlightening afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, President Estrada. To tell us more about the Bridges Dialogue Towards a Culture of Peace, may I call on the founding chairman of the International Peace Foundation, Mr. Uwe Morawetz.
Magandang hapon po, and welcome to the first ASEAN event series, Bridges Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the common patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with the various local partners, including the country's major universities. And I thank the Asian Institute of Management and its president, Francis Estrada, for hosting our event today. Having started in November 2007, Bridges is being continuously held in the Philippines and Thailand until April 2008, involving the participation of Nobel laureates for peace, physics, chemistry, medicine, and economics. The first ASEAN series of Bridges is an independent contribution to the Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, initiated and promoted by the United Nations General Assembly. It follows a series of 250 Bridges events, which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in Thailand between November 2003 and April 2005. 26 Nobel laureates, as well as 12 other keynote speakers and artists, such as Dr. Hans Blix, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Vanessa May and Jesse Norman participated in these events. They were presided over by Her Majesty Queen Sirikit and Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Maha Chakrisiranthorn, and reached an audience of 70,000 participants. As peace cannot be achieved instantly, but is a process which needs time, Bridges has not been organized as a single conference, but as an ongoing series of events in which Nobel laureates and international decision makers have built strong bridges with leaders in all parts of society and with the general public. With the basis for peace being education and synergies being the fruit of cooperation, the International Peace Foundation hasn't realized Bridges alone, but has carried out the program together with UNESCO and 75 other national and international institutions, including 23 major universities and schools. The multidisciplinary and pluralistic approach of Bridges in Thailand and of the events in the Philippines reflects that peace involves all parts of society. It involves awareness and social responsibility of politicians, the business community, scientists, artists, and the media. And since peace within ourselves, our families, and our environment starts in our minds and hearts, it involves every one of us. In this sense, Bridges challenges us to cross borders and to build bridges by listening and opening up to other viewpoints, by generating new thoughts, by developing innovative forms of cooperation, and by fulfilling the desire of everyone to get to know and to learn from each other. This can lead us to a world in which we will be able to understand each other and the complexities we face today in a new light. A globalized world needs broad strategies for change to secure a sustainable future for us and the next generations. Let us be inspired by the knowledge and the wisdom that Bridges continues to offer, an opportunity to get a more inclusive, interconnected, and comprehensive view of ourselves and the world in which we live, in which we are able to create anew constantly through dialogues towards a culture of peace which need the participation of everyone. I thank Professor Finn Kydland, the 2004 Nobel Laureate for Economics, who has agreed to come to the Philippines to support the events. And we look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. Maraming salamat po, and mabuhay.
Marami pong salamat, Ginoong Morawetz. May I acknowledge also the presence of the Philippine Honorary Chairman of the Bridges Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, Mr. Washington Sisip. May I now call on the Dean of AIM, Professor Victoria Licuanan, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Senator Legarda, Central Bank Governor Amado Tetanco, Mr. Washington Sisip, Mr. Jose Quisha, Mr. Uwe Morawetz, Mr. Estrada, and Mr. De Ocampo, Mrs. Tonya Kydland, members of the diplomatic community, Bridges partners and sponsors, students and faculty from AIM and from other educational institutions, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. It is my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you our speaker, Professor Finn Kydland. Professor Kydland has had a long and distinguished academic career, although in his own words, there was virtually no indication earlier in his life that he would become an academic. Professor Kydland is from Norway, having been born on a farm and grew up in a small town about 40 kilometers south of Stavanger, itself the fourth largest city in Norway, with a population, according to Google, in 2007 of 150,000 people. He pursued his bachelor's in economics at the Norwegian School of Economics and Business Administration, and at that point he expected to become a business manager. But when he was finishing his degree, an economics professor offered him a research assistant post, and this proved to be a critical decision that changed the rest of his life. Because of this, Professor Kydland continued at the Norwegian School as a research scholar, and then moved to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where he completed his PhD in 1993. And it was also during this time that he met Professor Edward Prescott, who became chairman of his PhD committee. After completing his PhD, Professor Kydland returned to Norway, where he taught at the Norwegian School for 5 years. Then he returned to Carnegie Mellon, and after joined the faculty of the University of California at Santa Barbara in 2004. At various points in his career, he also worked with the Federal Reserve Banks of Cleveland, St. Louis, and Dallas. But our story focuses on the work that he did with Professor Edward Prescott. The two professors began their cooperation in business cycle even when Professor Kydland was a student. In a paper in 1997 called Rules Rather Than Discretion, The Inconsistency of Optimal Plans, the two economists demonstrated how the declared commitment to a low inflation rate by policymakers might create expectations of low inflation and unemployment rates. Now, if this monetary policy were then changed and interest rates reduced, for example, to give a short-term boost to employment, policymakers' credibility is lost, and conditions are weakened by what we call discretionary policy. 10 years later, in another seminal paper, Time to Build and Aggregate Fluctuations in 1987, they demonstrated that technological changes or supply shocks, such as oil price hikes, for example, could be reflected in investment and relative price movements, and therefore create short-term fluctuations around long-term economic growth. Now, these may seem arcane to many people, but this work has very important implications to policymaking. And the work of Professor Kydland, as well as Professor Prescott, has influenced the design of monetary policy in many countries over the past decade. And in recognition of their work, in October 2004, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded the prize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, jointly to Professor Kydland and Professor Prescott for their contributions to dynamic macroeconomics. Today, Professor Kydland will speak to us on peace and economic development in an age of globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to present to you the 2004 Nobel Laureate for Economics, Professor Finn Kydland. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here to see so many people show up for this event. Very important series of which I'm lucky enough to be part. And so I thank Uwe Morawetz for having included me in this series. And I also thank my wife, Tanya, for being willing to come along, because otherwise I don't leave the North American continent unless she's willing to come along. So you may thank her as well for my being here. This is I have taken the step of putting the word peace into the title of my talk. And it's not as if I'm a big expert on that field. I know it's something that's being studied in various fields of universities and elsewhere. I suppose one of the things I could point to is that I have been going to a conference in Petra, Jordan, for 3 years now, and there'll be a fourth conference coming up in June. This conference is arranged by Elie Wiesel in cooperation with the King of Jordan. And the conference has gone under titles such as Saving the World or Building a Better World. And I have learned to appreciate at those conferences the importance of economic development for peace, the sense in which they go together. I'm not saying that one causes the other necessarily. In some cases, I think economic development is very important for avoiding conflicts. In other cases, things may be going along pretty well, and then conflicts arise, as, for example, recently in Pakistan, where I'm sure some corporations will be nervous about what has happened recently. And I suppose the only other qualification I might point to is I'm a Norwegian. Norwegians are known to travel all over the world to try to broker peace. Also, when Alfred Nobel instituted the Peace Prize, he didn't trust the Swedes to give it out like they do with all the other prizes. The Norwegians were put in charge of the Peace Prize. Now, let me give you a little motivation in the form of some numbers. I like to be quantitative, so whenever I can refer to numbers, that's I'm very happy. This is a collection. It looks like kind of an idiosyncratic collection of countries. It shows the progression over since 1950 until about 2005 for GDP per capita. These are taken from the so-called World Pen Tables, where the originators have done their best to make the numbers comparable across country by adjusting them for purchasing power parity. Obviously a tough thing to do, but for our purpose, the main thing will be to see some big differences across countries, and so small adjustments in these charts wouldn't really have made any difference for us. So here you have, as kind of a benchmark, the United States on top, and then I do have the Philippines in this picture. The Philippines, I don't know if it's going to show up. The Philippines, it's a, what would you say, fuchsia? Yeah, fuchsia-colored, well, like more or less like my tie. The Philippines evidently has been growing steadily, no particular dramatic downturns, although one might argue that it would be good that it grew even faster than it has so far. You'll notice one interesting country is, and I'll come back to that country later, Argentina. Argentina 120 years ago was one of the 5 or 6 richest countries in the world in this sense, one of the 5 or 6 most well-to-do countries. And even into the 50s and 60s, Argentina was doing reasonably well, but starting about 1980, Argentina has fallen on really hard times. And that curve for Argentina, kind of teal, bluish, is among the flattest of all of these countries in this picture. I'll show you two more pictures, and they are more systematic in the sense. Oh, by the way, before I leave that picture, the very bottom one, the yellow, that's the worst case in this plot, and that's Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is a country that has been inflicted with conflicts for decades and decades. This is here we have a number of European countries, and one thing. There are a couple of things interesting about this picture. They more or less go up together. There are a couple of countries a little lower than the others, Spain and Greece. And also in the beginning, Ireland was right in the cluster with Greece and Spain. As you can see, Ireland, the red curve, has really taken off since 1990. Ireland has made a dramatic jump. I mean, about 1990, as you can see, the GDP per capita was about 8,000 in 2005 dollars versus 12 or 13,000 for some of these other countries, Denmark, France, Germany, United Kingdom. By 2005, Ireland managed to catch up with these other countries. And one of my points of the talk is going to be, I think there's a lot to be learned from studying countries that haven't done so well, to look at what could it be about their policies that really hampers their development, and what would be an example of something a country can do if they really want to try to foster economic development. This is a much more depressing picture. Let me draw attention to this vertical scale. So the first two charts, GDP per capita goes from 0 to 40,000. That's the scale of these pictures. This one goes from 0 to 3,000. So 3,000, that would be about 1/13 of the max in the other pictures. And as you can see, there are countries hovering around 500. Very, very depressing. And not only is growth low in some of these countries, but it's highly variable. There could be periods in which there's a good spurt. I believe it's Burundi that shows a big spurt, and then everything it doesn't quite fall apart, but relatively speaking. There are some relatively well-behaved countries here. There's Cameroon, the yellow one, the one that's currently at the top of these. There's Lesotho. Lesotho is kind of an interesting country because they're right in the middle of South Africa, and they're sometimes used as an example in textbooks when we talk about the connection between GDP, gross domestic product, and gross domestic income. For the United States, for example, they're virtually identical, and it's true for there are good approximations to each other. For many countries, Lesotho is an example where gross domestic income would be much higher than gross domestic product, because many of their inhabitants cross the border to South Africa, work there, and then they bring home the income to their homeland. So Lesotho is doing relatively well. I have Chad in this picture, the orange curve, and Chad is a recent sad case. Obviously, I didn't know anything was going to happen in Chad because before the country was included in these charts, but so I suppose I showed a little foresight there, unintendedly. So the key message is, if you compare Europe and some other countries to some of these countries where conflicts prevail off and on, it's clear that there's a big difference, and one leads to the suspicion that economic development and peace must be tied somehow. One of the things also Elie Wiesel appears to have realized in his conferences, we're divided in 4 groups, and one of the 4 is especially devoted to studying economic development, presumably as it relates to peace. Let me just give a quick overview of the talk. I will say a few words about the framework of modern macroeconomics. I suppose because I always get nervous if I talk about material that's too far away from my own research, and because the topic of this talk is a broad topic, so there are several subtopics I could have chosen to speak from. So I'll prefer to talk about something that's quite related to my own research, and one of them is this distinction between rules versus discretion. It was mentioned in the introduction, and I'll say a few words about the fundamental reason for the policy inconsistency over time, and the potential bad outcomes from falling into that disease. I'll give 3 or 4 acute examples of where it's more likely to arise, or where it's likely to hit the hardest. I'll use Ireland and Argentina as examples. They are 2 countries I've studied in some detail, and with various co-authors. Argentina with Carlos Sarasaga, who's Argentine, and was very good at coming up with the data and so on. And Ireland with Mark Wynne, who's both of these 2 fellows are economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And at the end, to the extent I have time left, I'll say a few words, say something more generally about what fosters or hampers economic development. So back to the framework of modern macroeconomics. If you were to look in journal articles, you would see that just about all papers, all research papers fall in this category of being explicit about the decision-making framework of millions of people. People are characterized by their preferences especially over various sorts of goods, and leisure into the indefinite future. So they're very much forward-looking. People are constrained by their budgets over time, the economy as a whole is constrained by their resources. And there's another important resource constraint, namely time, built into these economies. So as I said, these economies, model economies, they can be programmed into a computer even smaller than the one sitting here on the podium. They are explicit about people's decision problems. These models contain thousands of businesses, and one important reason taking them into account is that they, to a large degree, define what's possible to do in the nations. They provide the aggregate capacity to produce stuff. And often we formulate that in the form of an aggregate production function that says how the two major inputs into production, namely capital, the sum of factories, machines, office buildings, and so on the one hand, and labor, all the input by all the workers, how that translates into goods and services, either in the form of consumption goods, households care about, or goods that can be used to augment future capacity. And essential in the production function is a description of technological change. That's a key thing that makes economies grow over time, that makes GDP per capita become larger over time. I keep saying that these economies are forward-looking, and let me just say a little bit about that, or say what it is about these economies that are different from the framework that used to prevail in the 60s or 70s. They're forward-looking in the sense that when you look at decisions today, you take into account the possibilities for the future. In the old-fashioned economies, I'm putting things simply now, but if you were to think about people's willingness or ability to consume, they were formulated in the form of equations whose parameters the researchers hoped to estimate from empirical data using statistical techniques. And these equations weren't particularly forward-looking. They would say something like, well, if income goes up, say, because the government gives you a tax reduction, something like 90% of that income would be consumed. And you get the feeling that in many people's minds, for example, in talking about the temporary fiscal stimulus package, as it's called in the United States, to try to avoid a recession, that many policymakers still think in those terms. But if you're forward-looking, then it turns out it becomes rational to think in terms of, well, if I get the temporary income increase, I'll spend only a small fraction of it, maybe 5 or 10%, and the rest I will save for the future. And that's an example of the sense in which these economies are forward-looking. Same thing with investment behavior. When you think about augmenting future productive capacity, you will think about your best guess about how productive this capital will be, not just next year, but 5 or 10 years into the future. The people who make those decisions, they care about the return after taxes, and so naturally you will also try to make guesses or anticipate what the government may possibly do during the lifetime of this factory in terms of taxation of capital income. And we can talk about similar things involving human capital augmentation through acquiring more education or learning by doing, somehow becoming more skillful for market production. For the purpose of my talk, I think I can go quickly over this, except to say that the key tool we tend to use for quantitative macroeconomics, which is what I'm interested in, the field where we look for answers to quantitative questions that demand a numerical answer, the computational experiment. We build these models of economies, these model of economies inhabited by people. We put them in the environment, in a realistic environment from which we can learn from their behavior. They behave as if they were actual economies over time, and then we compare them with the data. In these economies, and this is going to be key for my talk today, we can also add, in addition to the household sector and the business sector, the government sector. The government serves a very important role in providing many services that otherwise wouldn't have been provided: security, defense of the nation, and many other services that naturally are performed by the government. And the government gets revenue to pay for these services from, for example, taxing capital and labor income and through sales taxes and so on. Now, suppose we think of the government as being benign. The government has some objective function that is similar to the objective function of the typical people. Well, with people being quite different, that's a hard task, but let's just do the thought experiment that there is a well-defined function, a social welfare function we might call it, an objective that the government is determined to follow over time. And I'll make maybe a kind of a far-fetched assumption for the sake of the argument and say this function doesn't change over time. It's the same function regardless of which party or coalition of parties is in charge. Of course, that the fact that I'm abstracting from could be an additional complicating factor, but I'll save that for later. It turns out, and this is the thing that Prescott and I found in the paper that was mentioned in the introduction from 1977 about rules versus discretion. The surprising thing we found was that the optimal, in the sense of maximizing this objective, the optimal government policy in general is inconsistent over time. And it requires a commitment mechanism in order to be implemented. If you deviate from this optimal policy, if you are indeed inconsistent over time in this sense, and we thought we provided some rather powerful examples, one in the context of monetary policy, one in the context of fiscal policy, the alternative outcomes can be very bad. Now, the fundamental reason for the inconsistency is, is something that's not that easy to explain to the non-PhD economist. And the reason I know that is when we first presented our paper, the first time I presented the paper at the conference, after about two minutes, all hell broke loose, and everyone was trying to figure out where the mistake was. Now, once you think about it, the reason is not so difficult. If the government were to choose an optimal policy, one that maximizes its unchanging objective function covering today and the indefinite future, that policy, for it to be optimal, it has to take into account the effect it has on people's I mean, I'm talking about households decisions, consumption decisions, labor input decisions, the effect it has on businesses' investment decisions over time. And many of these decisions, as I hope I convinced you of in my a couple of examples of the importance of forward-lookingness, many of these decisions are such that current decisions depend on what people think the government will do in the future. Not just what they're doing this year, but what they will do 5 or 10 years into the future. My example of taxes on capital, future taxes on capital, is an example. The importance of it for the investment decision today. But it could also be important for when you think about whether to acquire more, go to school 2 more years for a master's rather than taking a job right away. You might want to think about or have some expectation about how much the additional income from going to school, how much will that be taxed in the future. Now, so that has to be taken into account in this government policy, optimal policy rule. The key thing that makes it tempting to change the policy in the future is, well, suppose we fast forward 5 years. This policy has been followed for a while. Factories have been built. People have become more educated, etc. The government realizes, well, these decisions that dependent on what I'm about to do now, from now on and further into the future, these decisions for the first 5 years have already been made. There's no reason for me to take into account the effect of policy from now on decisions that have already been made. And so that's the key fundamental reason for this timing consistency. Now, where is the temptation the greatest? To me, this is the most powerful case, namely having to do with accumulating something at great cost currently, but something that yields services or a revenue long time into the future. An example is physical capital. Another example is human capital. The tax environment makes a difference for businesses in willingness to invest. Once they've made that investment, once the factory is there, if the taxes were to be raised, most of them would not shut down. They would still continue to operate. It would seem, especially if the government thinks there's an emergency need for revenue, it would seem an easy way to get revenue, and that's part of the temptation. The government would be tempted to say, well, I'm sorry, we're going to tax you heavily now. That goes against what we had promised. Instead, we'll go back to the original tax environment from next year on, or 3 years from now. Now, these kinds of promises, if you've broken your promise once, they're very unlikely to be believed by anyone. Another example, and this is what has happened in many Latin American countries, for example, governments had issued bonds at nominal interest rates and in their own currency. The government could be tempted to renege on their debt. I would call that the partial default on a debt, and an easy way to do it is through a surprise inflation. Under hyperinflations, as happened in the Argentina, Bolivia, and many other countries, this debt could become virtually worthless to the holders, to the government. It has the effect that it costs them virtually nothing in real terms to pay it back. Now, so with this dire problem, or this possibility of this being having a bad effect on the economy, if the government succumbs to that kind of temptation, investors will clearly be more nervous about investing in that country, and economic development is likely to suffer dramatically. It's natural for a country then to think of mechanisms to try to commit itself, try to shore up credibility, try to convince the public that they're not going to do this sort of thing. The examples of mechanisms that have been used, unfortunately, not so much in the context of fiscal policy. And I tend to think that fiscal policy is the most important part of government policy for economic development. In monetary policy, that's also important, of course. In monetary policy, there have been examples of commitment mechanisms, ways of trying to tie your hands. Unfortunately, not always so successfully in the sense of lasting very long. One of the ways that lasted the longest, it lasted for maybe a century or more, was the gold standard, namely tying your currency to the price of gold. But that fell apart so long ago, I'm guessing very few here would remember, and that was before I was born, and so that means that there couldn't be many who remember it. Currency board is another example. Argentina had a very bad decade, as you'll see in a few minutes. In the 1980s, Carlos Menem took over power, and he realized he had to try to do something to shore up the credibility of the nation. And so he instituted a currency board, which meant that they accumulated dollar reserves, and then they committed themselves, supposedly, to tie the peso, their local currency, to the dollar 1 for 1. And that seemed to work for about 8 to 9 years, and then everything fell apart. And one of the things they did was they failed to take into account that monetary policy and fiscal policy are interrelated. They're interrelated, for example, that they're part of the same budget constraint. But more importantly, in Argentina, the provinces had the ability to accumulate debt to pay for their expenses. And in the late 90s, it turned out they had accumulated so much debt they would not be able to pay it back. And then they came running to the government, something that's possible to do in Argentina under their constitution. The provinces don't have a balanced budget law as most states in the United States, for example. And then the federal government had to bail them out, and the debt in Argentina mushroomed. I can't go into details of exactly what made everything fall apart, but the currency board worked only for about 8 to 9 years. The third example is to make central banks, the conductors of monetary policy, independent from political pressure from the rest of the government. And that has seemingly been quite successful in the past 10 or 20 years. Some banks were independent going way back. The one that was known to be quite independent in their behavior, namely the Bundesbank in Germany, is no longer around because Germany is now part of the European Central Bank. So they're part of running monetary policy jointly for a number of nations. The Federal Reserve Board or the central bank in the United States is reasonably independent, although we've seen recently that they're certainly under lots of pressure from policymakers. The Bank of England used to be under the basically under the rest of the government, but it was made independent in 1997. Several central banks have clearly become more independent over the past 10 or 20 years. The central banks of Scandinavia. Some people are nice enough to give Prescott and me some credit for that happening. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'll take the credit, of course. In practice, what some of the more successful banks have done is they've targeted inflation. They've said that our target is going to be, well, it could vary from country to country. It could be 2%, 3% a year. And the idea is if there is a shock to try to stay as close to the target as you can. This inflation targeting has seemingly worked well for 10 or 20 years now. I would argue that the test may still be still may yet be there to come. That was not a good sentence. Sorry. And a reason for that, I think, is that the central banks have not really been tested. There haven't been a big shock. We seem to be coming up. We seem to have seen a big shock now, and now we'll see how well they do. I would argue that, and this argument comes from, it's very much rooted in my understanding of the time inconsistency issue and its potential importance and also potential devastating effects. I don't think that inflation targeting is equivalent to price level targeting. So price level targeting could be something like you say the price level, our goal is to have the price level be so-and-so in 5 years, so-and-so in 10 years, and those levels could be consistent with an average inflation rate of, say, 2%. Okay, so that's why it would be natural to think that inflation targeting and price level targeting would be equivalent. A given price level movement is associated year by measured inflation rate changes. Inflation is defined to be the change per period of the price level. Now, what's likely to happen in practice if there's a shock? Suppose there's a shock that makes inflation jump. Under price level targeting, you would be committed to bring the price level back to the original path so that you still be on target for reaching your goal over the next 5 or 10 years. With inflation targeting, my suspicion is that it would be very tempting, based on my understanding of the time inconsistency issue, it would be very tempting to say, oh, we were unlucky. It's true that inflation rose dramatically. We'll start our new path from here. Okay, from now on, the goal will still be 2% inflation increase per year. And in the end, that will mean a higher price level in 5 or 10 years than originally was envisioned. Now, let me talk about so I don't really think monetary policy is the main factor for economic growth. It's very important to provide a stable environment also for monetary policy, but I think the key factors are more from the fiscal side, and these are factors that could be driving innovative activity and technological change. You already got the idea from my presentation of the production function. Technological change is a driving force for the aggregate economy, for the output of goods and services, and therefore for the income of the nation's people. These are very much forward-looking decisions, but it's also important that along with innovative activity, the ability to produce goods cheaper or more efficient goods, or making more efficient machines and so on, along with that, it's important that you actually build those machines, you build those factories to take advantage of the technological change. And that's where the credibility of that nation is particularly important, is particularly crucial, and the government can contribute to adding to that credibility, or it can contribute to making that country not very credible at all. And here's where my example of Argentina I think will be very illustrative. Suddenly I got confused because I saw myself. I expected a picture of Argentina, and now there's me. Okay, so can everyone... There was a time when everything was over there, because I remember pointing in that direction, but for the first charts. So here's a picture of Argentina, and this plot of GDP per working age person starts in 1950, just like my previous three plots for a bunch of countries. Argentina did reasonably well until 1980. You saw in the first picture that reasonably well still meant that they were well below a bunch of other countries, but by Argentine standards, reasonably well until 1980. In 1980, or in the 80s, bad things happened. Some people call it the lost decade. It lasted exactly a decade, from 1980 to 1990. Output per working age person dropped by over 20%. A mind-boggling drop in output per working age person. Then Argentina seemingly recovered, maybe because of these policies instituted by Carlos Menem in part, that I already mentioned. And then in about 1998, everything fell apart again. And in that case, a similar 20% plus drop in output, GDP per working age person, and this time over only half the time. Devastating changes in that nation. So I got interested in this because Carlos Sarsaga and I were asked to study the 1980s to see what modern macroeconomics could say about the reasons for that Great Depression in Argentina. But after we were done with the work we were asked to do, we decided to, we had the numbers, we had the data, we might as well put the numbers into a modern macroeconomic model, calibrated to Argentina, and then see what happened. And we got a big surprise that said that in light of the high rate of productivity growth in Argentina, Argentina should have grown even much faster in the 1990s. The capital stock should have been much bigger. And here's an illustration of what we found. These are the data. Remember, these are not per working age person. This is simply GDP. So you don't see that big drop. The population growth keeps GDP from really falling much in in the 80s. But you see the big, seemingly big rise from 1990 to 1998. Then you get the big drop into 2002. The model says this is what should have happened. These are the data. Here's what the model says. And actually that rise, that peak for the model is almost 20% higher than for the data. That's an astounding difference. And so one can think about possible explanations, and to Carlos Sarsaga and me, it's pretty obvious. So the model was constructed on the assumption that everything was going nicely. Argentina didn't suffer from any credibility problems or anything like that. Well, that's obvious. That's evidently an assumption that one should not make. And our conjecture is that that Argentina fell prey to what we call the time inconsistency disease, and that's because of the memory people had, or potential investors had, from the hyperinflation that took place in the 1980s, and it wasn't the first one. Devaluations, deposit freezes, defaults on government obligations, all of that resulted in lack of credibility for Argentina. This is perhaps the most, except for the plot for Africa that you saw at the beginning, this is perhaps the most depressing picture in my talk. This shows the capital stock per working age person over the past 25 years or so. You see the peak in 1982, and then by 2003 it was down to 20% less than in 1982. Just a mind-boggling drop. While for most countries, the capital stock has either remained unchanged or been rising. So a developing country is typically characterized by the capital stock rising per working age person. So we could ask ourselves, will Argentina ever recover? And there's no easy answer, because once you lose the credibility, we don't know much about how you can restore it, other than convincing people that you are indeed trying to conduct policy for the long run, not just focusing on the next month or half a year or so on. You need to convince the relevant decision makers you are worried you are providing an environment for the next 5 or 10 years or more. So as I already said, the key has to be in policy. Promoting economic development must be a focus on incentives for productivity growth, innovation, and capital accumulation. And I saw a signal from my beautiful wife that I must be running out of time. And but I would like to mention the Ireland example as a contrast with Argentina before I close. So Ireland, you saw that it was hovering down there along the bottom of the 7 or 8 European countries for which I showed you a picture. And then it took off in the 1990s. There are at least 2 factors that must have been important. One was in the 60s and maybe early 70s, that's when Ireland decided to make secondary education free of charge. And so if we go 20 years later, Ireland finds itself with a potentially highly qualified, highly skillful potential workforce. But that's not enough. They also need to be productive. In the market sector, they need factories and machines. They need something to work with in order to to make that potential productivity come to fruition. And so what Irish policymakers did was they said that around 1990, if you invest in this country, if you set up factories here, and not just Irish potential factories, factories like Dell and others, if you set up factories here, these are going to be the tax rates you will be facing for the next 20 years. Not just next year, not just in 1992, 93, and so on, all the way to 2009. And that means, assuming it was credible, and evidently it was credible, you know you have removed the uncertainty about future taxes for the lifetime of the factory you might be thinking about building. And that's a very important thing. There's enough uncertainty in the world as it is. It's kind of ridiculous, if you think about it, for the government to introduce more uncertainty than necessary. I have run out of time, so I'll just I'll skip this and simply end up. I kind of talked about these things, so I don't feel badly about skipping one slide. Let me just end with paraphrasing the conclusion of a book that I recommend to everyone to read. One of the modern books about economic developments by Parent and Prescott. It's entitled Barriers to Riches. It's actually a very compact book, not always so easy to read, but it has lots of good examples from various countries. And the conclusion was, paraphrasing it, with good policy, there is potential in poor nations for not 1 to 2%, but 1,000 to 2,000% income increase. Now, the authors obviously thought it was. They obviously thought that this was in the ballpark of what's possible. It's kind of cute to simply add 3 zeros to those to the 1 and 2, but it's not incredible, because if you think about a nation among the ones I had in the initial plots, remember that the most well-to-do nations had income or GDP per capita of about 30,000, 35,000. Some of the bottom ones, the ones for Africa, 500 maybe, 1,000. 1,000% increase, that's increasing tenfold. So that just brings you up from, say, 500 to 5,000, or from 1,000 to 10,000. And that should be doable. And I firmly believe that doing so, and I think there are lots of examples of that, and I think Elie Wiesel agrees with me, doing so will make the conditions much more favorable for lasting peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kydland. Our first reactor for this afternoon is the Governor of the Central Bank of the Philippines. As Governor, he is also either chair or a member of a number of government agencies, such as the Anti-Money Laundering Council, the Philippine International Convention Center, the Capital Market Development Council, PhilExport Board of Trustees, and Philippine Deposit Insurance Corporation, to name a few. He also represents the country in various international and regional organizations, including the Executive Meeting of East Asia and the Pacific, ASEAN and ASEAN +3, Southeast Asia Central Banks, Center for Latin American Monetary Studies, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. He also served as alternate executive director of the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s. May I now invite Governor Armando M. Tetanco, Jr. to give his reaction.
Thank you very much. Senator Legarda, Professor Kydland, AIM Chairman Joy Quisha, Mr. Sisip, Mr. Morawetz, Dr. De Ocampo, AIM President Estrada, my colleagues at the BSP, special guests, Dean Liguanan, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to join you on this occasion. But before I proceed, I'd like to congratulate the International Peace Foundation and its partners for the success of the event, or the event series Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. On behalf of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, I would like to thank the Foundation for inviting us to be a part of this worthy and noble undertaking. I would also like to congratulate Professor Kydland for a highly enlightening discussion on a subject that is front and center in the minds of policymakers. I particularly appreciated how deftly your influential work of time inconsistency in economic policy, many in close collaboration with Professor Edward Prescott, has been braided into the ambit of peace and economic development. This afternoon, allow me to home in on specific areas in your presentation that are relevant to the institution that I represent. Professor Kydland, together with Edward Prescott, has made fundamental contributions to two major areas of macroeconomic research. One, the design of public policy in such a way as to avoid what came to be known as the time consistency, or as some would put it, the time inconsistency problem. And two, the empirical methods available for gauging the impact of contemplated policy changes. As it turned out, both of these areas had their most profound impact in the field of monetary policy. It is in this respect that I would like to develop the outline of my discussion. First is on how the introduction of the time consistency issue and the consequent debate on the extent to which rules and discretion should figure in the conduct of economic policy have supported changes in the framework by which central banks formulate monetary policy. Second, I'd like to turn to the Philippines' experience in meeting the challenges posed by rapid financial innovation and globalization. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, central bankers, along with the majority of economists, thought that you could trade off a little bit more inflation if you wanted less unemployment. By the 1970s, however, the theoretical and empirical literature showed that this was not so. If monetary stimulus tried to push unemployment below the natural rate, the result would be accelerating inflationary expectations. Professors Kydland and Prescott presented this policy dilemma as one of the several examples in the general problem in economic policy making, the time inconsistency problem. In brief, a policymaker who cannot commit to a rule in advance, that is, who reserves to himself the right to introduce discretion in policy formulation, would be perceived by the public as facing an incentive to renege on its policy commitment. This creates a credibility gap, which results in both the public and the policy authorities' failure to achieve their goals. In the particular area of monetary policy, they showed that economic policymakers who cannot commit to a rule in advance often will conduct a policy that gives rise to high inflation despite their stated objective of low inflation. Kydland and Prescott considered the possibility of conducting monetary policy in terms of long-run rules, which can be difficult to change. In the early literature, the debate focused on rules, which prescribed how the central bank should react to major contingencies. A major drawback of such rules, however, is that they can restrict flexibility in policymaking in response to unexpected events. Kydland and Prescott, as well as much of the policy research then, shifted to an emphasis on the design of the institutional framework, that is, the institutions of policy making. It is in this context that inflation targeting has been embraced by many central banks. Inflation targeting can be seen as an instance of what Svensson refers to as constrained discretion. Inflation targeting as a monetary policy framework introduces key features that constitute a disincentive for the central bank to stray away from the long-run objective of price stability. It is characterized by a pre-announcement of an inflation target, which creates possible costs in terms of credibility should the central bank be perceived by the public as being half-hearted in seeking to pursue the specific numerical goal of inflation. In our case, inflation targeting has reinforced our commitment to achieving price stability. A central bank's credibility and reputation, which some would say is the most important capital, more important even than its financial capital, rests on this commitment. Inflation targeting, therefore, can be considered what Professor Kydland has referred to earlier as a commitment mechanism, which needs to be in place in order to prevent the occurrence of time inconsistency in government policies. Recognizing its value in the achievement of price stability, the BSP, like other central banks, have adopted inflation targeting framework in the conduct of monetary policy. Allow me to briefly discuss its key features. First, it has a simple framework, which is basically the announcement of an explicit inflation target. In our case, 2 years in advance, that the BSP promises to achieve over a given period of time. Second, it reflects a comprehensive approach to policy by taking into consideration the widest set of available information about the economy. Third, it's forward-looking, as it recognizes that monetary policy actions affect inflation with a lag. This addresses Professor Kydland's message towards the end of his presentation that government policy has to be forward-looking. A forward-looking perspective is one of the basic tenets of the inflation targeting approach. It makes considerable use of indicators that have forward-looking content, such as business cycle trends, early warning systems, and expectation surveys, as well as financial market indicators. Fourth, transparency and effective communication are integral to the inflation targeting framework. This is because the Bangko Sentral needs to be accountable for its policy actions and decisions. Indeed, the de jure and de facto independence of the Bangko Sentral presupposes accountability. It is the quid pro quo for delegating the responsibility of promoting price stability to the central bank. Accountability carries with it the need to be transparent and to clearly convey to the market the reasons for policy decisions and actions. The broad aim is to make monetary policy easier for the public to appreciate and enable them to better monitor the BSP's commitment to the inflation target, thus helping in anchoring inflation expectations and in encouraging informed debate on monetary policy issues. In direct relation to the theme of economic development, inflation targeting as an institutional framework has been found to have contributed to the moderation of inflation and output fluctuations. There is a growing body of evidence showing that policies that moderated inflation has helped promote output stabilization, economic growth, and efficient resource allocation in the long run. This is because these policies lay the underpinnings for both wealth creation and wealth preservation, as economic agents better able to make informed consumption and investment decisions. The Asian Development Bank, for instance, attributed the region's vibrant economic performance to better economic policies and stronger institutional frameworks as a result of reform efforts pursued in the post-Asian crisis period. Chairman Bernanke also emphasized the role of monetary policy in helping to reduce macroeconomic volatility In particular, he postulated that monetary policies that moderated inflation could, 1, help stabilize the structure of the economy, 2, affect the size and frequency of shocks hitting the economy, 3, change the sensitivity of pricing and other economic decisions to exogenous shocks, and 4, stabilize inflation expectations, which by themselves can be an independent source of economic volatility. In this presentation, Professor Kydland notes how rapid innovative activity and technological change have been major driving forces that propel economic growth. Two factors that have figured prominently in this process are financial innovation and globalization. Globalization can have a salutary impact on economic growth. Greater economic integration provides incentives for economic agents to increase their competitiveness and flexibility and reduce inefficiencies. Kenneth Rogoff et al. Looked at the effects of financial globalization on developing countries and found some evidence that countries have derived benefits from financial integration in terms of both higher growth and macroeconomic stability once they have crossed a certain threshold. This threshold is dependent on an array of factors that relate to the soundness of their macroeconomic policies and the quality of social and economic institutions, as well as the depth of the financial system. This analysis suggests that the benefits of globalization could best be extracted with sound policies, a stable macroeconomic framework, and good institutions. As a central banker, this message resonates strongly. Responsible monetary policies as well as a well-functioning financial system are key to ensuring that the benefits from globalization are maximized and that the economy is well prepared to meet the challenges. The primary objective of the monetary policy of the BSP is to promote price stability conducive to growth. An environment of stable prices supports growth because it allows households and businesses to plan ahead and arrive at better informed decisions relative to their consumption, investment, savings, and production needs. Furthermore, the BSP's commitment to price stability supports a more equitable distribution of the country's wealth and resources. We are mindful that high inflation hurts the poor most or more than any segment of society, as they do not have adequate assets that serve as hedges against inflation. At the same time, the BSP also endeavors to maintain the soundness of the financial system. With growing global financial integration coupled with financial innovation, as well as what we have recently seen as a breakdown in risk management systems of financial institutions, the transmission of financial crisis or contagion in recent years has become more rapid. The costly financial crisis of the late 90s have called for the institutional reforms and safety nets in order to better cope and withstand financial disruptions. In this regard, the BSP has adopted reforms in the banking system, including mandating banks to conform with IAS, IFRS, or the new international accounting standards. We have also beefed up governance requirements for banks by implementing the fit and proper rule as a standard for directors and senior officers. Furthermore, we have instituted improvements in our regulatory and supervisory frameworks to effectively manage risks inherent in today's highly complex financial environment and avoid systemic disturbances, including the adoption of new risk-based capital requirements of Basel II, starting July 2007. Indeed, the central bank has a role in maintaining stability in both the monetary environment as well as the financial markets, two pillars that help ensure the economy stays on a path of sustained economic growth. Let me digress here a little bit. Relating to stability in the economy, it would be interesting to find out the good professor's views on the central bank's role in resolving issues such as the adverse impact of the subprime problem in the U.S. on the financial markets as well as on the real sector. The recent movements in the financial markets stemming from subprime woes, I believe, highlight the fact that the financial systems do look to the central bank, in this case the Fed and other major central banks, as anchor during situations of financial volatility. Issues such as the role of the central bank as a lender of last resort and containment of moral hazard. Perhaps later on, Professor Kydland could provide us his insights on this particular issue. In addition to its discharge of its primary mandate, the BSP likewise pursues programs that aim to promote broad-based growth and uplift social welfare, including of those who are marginalized and who are currently outside the economic mainstream. One of our flagship advocacies is the promotion of microfinance. Microfinance activities provide the country's enterprising poor access to a broad range of financial services, such as deposits, loans, payment services, money transfers, and insurance. The number of banks providing microfinance services has increased over the years, while greater involvement by large commercial banks in microfinance activities has been noted. We have also continued to promote financial learning, including among overseas Filipinos. More specifically, the BSP has taken a proactive stance in embarking on a consumer education program that aims to improve the basic financial literacy of the public. In 2007, we initiated the Regional Economic and Financial Learning Centers project aimed at establishing libraries, statistical and learning centers for the regional economic and financial learning centers, as well as building skills and capabilities of regional centers staff members. Likewise, the BSP continued its public information campaigns outside Metro Manila in line with efforts to enhance public awareness of the role of the BSP in the country's economic development and to further enhance the transparency of monetary policy. The professor's research has had important implications in the ability of governments to implement credible and sound economic policies. His work has profoundly influenced the practice of economic policy in general and monetary policy in particular. And today, we learned the broader implications of his contributions to economic and social development. The BSP likewise recognizes how economic underdevelopment comes in the way of lasting peace. This is why the Bangko Sentral is steadfastly committed to being an agent that promotes and preserves macroeconomic stability through the disciplined conduct of monetary policy, through the prudent oversight of the health of the banking system, and through the pursuit of advocacies that are supportive of broad-based and participatory economic development. Thank you and good day.
Thank you, Governor Tatanco. Our other reactor is an authority in the field of global finance and economic development. He was Secretary of Finance from 1994 to 1998. In 1995, he was named Finance Minister of the Year by Euromoney magazine, the first Filipino and the first ASEAN finance minister to achieve this recognition. He is the immediate past president of the Asian Institute of Management. Now a member of the AIM Board of Trustees, he is also presently chair of the Board of Advisors of the RFO Center for Public Finance and Regional Economic Cooperation, which has recently been designated as an ADB Regional Knowledge Hub. May I invite Dr. Roberto F. De Ocampo to deliver his reaction.
It is a rare opportunity to be able to be asked to react to a Nobel laureate. Being a dabbler economist myself, I find it a great privilege to be asked to react to an icon in international economics. But in order to reduce the risk of embarrassing myself, I not only tried my best to listen as intently as possible, but I did a bit of reading on some of the major works and theories of Professor Kydland. Let me discuss two major ideas that the professor had propounded, namely total factor productivity and the problem of credibility. From my understanding, total factor productivity is an index of all factors other than labor and capital, not explicitly accounted for, but which contribute to the generation of output. These include, among others, monetary shocks and actions of the political party in power, climate changes like El Niño and global warming, a firm's managerial capabilities, organizational competence, research and development, and diffusion of technology. The latter is regarded as the biggest subsection of TFP, or total factor productivity. Some see total factor productivity as the real driver of growth within an economy, and some studies reveal that while labor and investment are important contributors, total factor productivity may account for up to 60% of growth within economies. Various observers describe today's global economy as one in transition to a knowledge economy, that is, an interconnected, globalized economy where knowledge resources such as know-how, expertise, creativity, and intellectual property are more critical than other economic resources such as labor and capital. In the knowledge economy, three major drivers occur which boost competitive advantage. One, knowledge is what we buy, sell, and do. Two, intellectual capital is the new wealth. And three, knowledge productivity is the biggest challenge. The essence of the first characteristic of the knowledge economy is that the economic activities have shifted from brawn to brain, or from people working with their hands to people working with their heads, from tangible resources like brick and mortar to intangible resources like knowledge. The second pillar of the knowledge economy is a logical consequence of the first. It stresses the shift from financial and physical assets in the industrial economy towards knowledge assets or intellectual capital in the knowledge economy. Intellectual capital refers to non-monetary and non-physical resources. The concept of intellectual capital is based on the belief that the main resources for building competitive advantage are intangible resources. For example, the value of an Intel dual-core processor or Nike running shoe does not lie in the cost price of the components or materials used to assemble the product, but in the knowledge and skills of the people who designed or developed the product and the marketing power of the companies that sell the products. These are all intangible assets or intellectual capital. The third pillar is knowledge productivity. If one accepts as true that knowledge has become our main source of relative advantage and intellectual capital is the new wealth, then the process of transforming this resource into wealth has become the new challenge. Thus, as the productivity of knowledge will be the determining factor in the knowledge economy, the main responsibility of today's management is to make knowledge productive. Moreover, not only is the main source of production knowledge and the tools of production brains owned by the employees, but the biggest challenge in the knowledge economy is the productivity of the knowledge worker. Notably, in light of all this, Peter Drucker once proclaimed that the knowledge worker productivity is the biggest challenge of the 21st century for management. However, despite all this, I do agree with the professor that TFP is a limited measure. And as you mentioned in your paper on Argentina's gap puzzle, you reinforce that. And as most studies I've come across suggest that the theoretical problems underlying the notion of total factor productivity are so significant that the whole concept might even need to be somewhat reviewed. The most glaring point being the so-called attribution problem, meaning what what in a total productivity is the combination or proportion that you would assign to the factors that lead to that particular overall total productivity. Now, because of this, I would like to focus now on your second point, which is the problem of credibility. As mentioned in your discussion on time consistency of economic policy and the driving forces behind business cycles, forward-looking governments make plans and policy decisions based on assumptions and known variables. As such, sequential policy making may be limited by credibility constraints, giving rise to the problem of credibility in the eyes of the public and business and industry included. When government opts to change its policies, it practices discretionary planning. This, according to the professor, results in lower welfare than the outcome wherein government can commit. Well, hard to disagree with, and I fully agree with the professor's observations when he looks at the contrasting styles between Argentina and Ireland. The lack of investor confidence in Argentina's constant devaluation, government defaults, corruption, freezing of domestic prices for utilities, and renegotiation of contracts with concessionaires led to a credibility problem. Sounds familiar? Argentina had hit hyperinflation in 1989 with an annual rate of over 3,000%. And to combat the crisis, government embarked on trade liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. However, because of its international debt obligations and government's continued high spending and corruption, tax evasion, and money laundering, investor confidence in the region spiraled, and all these factors contributed to Argentina's plummet into a recession. In the case of Ireland, the country experienced increased inflation due mainly to a rapid rise of unemployment, massive foreign borrowings for current spending, and an overvalued currency, coupled with globally stagnant economic development in the mid-70s. But they went into a transformation strategy characterized by tax cuts, welfare reform, reduction in government spending as a percentage of GDP, increased competition, incentives for the private sector and for foreign investments, a strategy which has been central to the positive economic surge of Ireland and continues to be followed, if you want to talk about consistency, by succeeding administrations. In short, Ireland's strategy was the positioning of the private sector as the main engine of growth. Thus, from being one of the poorest countries in Europe 20 years ago, Ireland now stands as one of the richest in the world. The Philippines looks like it shares closer attributes with Argentina than Ireland. Let me provide you some interesting statistics. In the Growth Competitiveness Index, which is composed of three indices: Technology Index, Public Institutions Index, and Macroeconomic Environment Index. How do we rank? Philippines in 2006 ranked 77, Argentina ranked 78. We beat them by one, huh? Ireland ranked 29, it's way up there. How about Corruption Perception Index? Self-explanatory. Philippines, the higher your number, the more you're a champion of corruption. Philippines ranked 131. Argentina, 105. They beat us. And Ireland, 17. Human Development Index, which is a measure of a couple of things: long, healthy life, education, and a high standard of living. Philippines, 90. That's way down there. Argentina, actually, in 2007, 38. And Ireland, 5th. As my co-reactor is an expert on monetary policy, I'm not going to discuss this. In fact, monetary policy's consistency is probably one of the highlights of our governance in this country. Congratulations, Mr. Governor. But there have been problems of inconsistency and credibility. Let me just enumerate a few by citing certain paradigms. I cite paradigms because paradigms are supposed to be the bedrock, the consistent thing. As the professor says, the key upon which everything else is supposed to be measured and to be coherent. Let's take a few of our favorites, and I'm not citing just the present administration. This is across the board. Paradigm number one, democracy. Okay, we love it to death, right? We would rather have a country run like hell by Filipinos than like heaven by others. Well, I'm not going to go at length about the democracy issue. For that, you might want, I refer you to a number of speeches given by Chairman Washington CSIP, who has described the follies of our democratic system very effectively. Let me just say that on the credibility issue, the credibility of a democratic system relies upon the credibility of its election process and institutions. India, with more than 1 billion people, can get its votes counted in a day. It takes us more than a month and a half, and after that, we're not even sure if the outcome is credible. Number two, and again, this is a paradigm, since every government has consistently said this is it. We are pro-poor, all right? But in spite of our being pro-poor, the poor not only are still with us, there are more of them than ever before, and the gap between the rich and the poor is actually widening. Why is that? Partly because, in spite of the consistency of saying you're pro-poor, the policies that are enunciated are either populist and therefore are given to handout type of approaches, or they are knee-jerk reactions in the interest of thinking you're serving the poor. Let me give you a recent example. Recently, for instance, there was a humongous cut in power rates. I think it went down to 1/3 of what they ought to be, in the interest of keeping the poor from being hurt, in spite of the fact that a great deal of the poor are on minimum bill. Okay, so we cut it down to just 1/3. What did it do? It ran up deficits like crazy on the fiscal position, and this, as the governor says, actually hurt the poor. But you see, the poor are not the first ones to understand the nuances of fiscal deficits. They certainly can understand when a power cut is made. But what's the result? We end up having to raise new taxes in order to cover that big deficit. And we called it reform. So when we introduced a reform VAT, some may actually argue that that was not reform, that was simply the financing of fiscal folly after the fact. Again, following from a paradigm of consistently being pro-poor. Third paradigm. The country's population is mostly agricultural, the labor force is in agriculture, and therefore we should pay attention to agriculture and free the farmer. Has it happened? Right now, there is a bill in Congress because the Land Reform Act is about to expire. And the question is, are they going to allow it to expire? Are they going to reform it? Or are they just going to renew it? And some are saying, well, let's renew it so that everybody can say we're still for land reform. But the land reform, as we have practiced it, has certainly focused only on ownership and not on productivity, so that productivity has gone down, and our ability to be globally competitive in agro-industry has not happened. Certainly the temptation to distribute land titles in the middle of a basketball court by politicians to all sorts of farmers who would then thank them and perhaps vote them again is very great. But that is not going to result in agricultural productivity that will result in global advantage. Let me give you a final paradigm so I don't go blabbing away too long. In order to help the poor, we need to create jobs And in order to create jobs that are not created by domestic investors, we need foreign investments. How can you argue? Again, we ended up, however, with foreign investment acts that are replete with incentives, many of which no longer are necessary, and a lot of which are simply protectionist. As a result, you don't really generate the jobs you want to create, and once again, you threaten the fiscal position. Now there is a review of the Foreign Investments Act and a review of incentives, and one would hope that in spite of the fact that that paradigm is consistent, we will look at the way the policy itself is made to prosper. So in sum, does one say, therefore, that let's throw out all these paradigms because they've made a mess of things? No, not really. It's the policies after the paradigms that might have made a mess of things. But perhaps, learning from Ireland, we may need another, you might say, foundation for consistency that could encompass all these others. And to me, that may mean two things, listening to the professor. One is the philosophy of government as enabler rather than as provider. As long as the government is tempted to look like God Almighty to help everyone, as long as housing, for example, is interpreted to mean that government will provide everybody a house, as long as we think that the politician's role is to be thanked, then do expect these inconsistencies to happen. Government as enabler will bring the private sector as the main engine of growth. The second, of course, and the professor alluded to it very strongly, is for us to begin to look long-term. Of course, our problem is that our attention span tends to be between two elections, and that may not be long-term enough. Thank you very much, Professor, for your enlightenment, which I hope we can continue to apply to our own situation.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Ocampo. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open for questions. We have microphones strategically located in the hall. And to facilitate the program flow, please limit your queries to one per person. And please identify yourself and your organization. Over there, Mr. Henry Grajeda of AIM. I will identify you for you.
Thank you. As a development scholar myself, I thought one of the most interesting slides was the one that you skipped. So instead of a question, could we ask you to please discuss that slide? Thank you.
Sounds like a fair request. Professor Kydland, would you care to, I believe that was the slide on income and wealth disparities across nations.
You might first make it. Yeah.
It was the second to the last.
So you already saw signs of that in the first three pictures I had. The disparities across nations in terms of income per capita are tremendous. Some of the poorest countries, income may be 1/60th of the income of the more well-to-do nations. And one may wonder what are the main reasons for that, and it turns out that almost always it results from bad policy of some sort. Within the framework I talked about, remember that I emphasized the importance of innovation, improving the technology, and so on. It's been highlighted also, emphasized also in the discussion, the very interesting discussion. I should say, by the way, that I learned a lot from the two discussants. I'm very glad you set up the program this way. I thought that was tremendous. Many policies restrict the set of technologies that can be used. And that can be for many reasons, and I don't think you'll allow me to go into, I agree this is an important slide. I don't think you'll allow me to spend a whole lecture on it, but let me just say that often it's the protection of vested interests that is behind. There are important interest groups in nations that happen to have the ear of the politicians. They realize they will lose in the short run with new technologies being adapted. That's very short-sighted. It's very short-sighted for a nation to go along with that. In the long run, everyone would benefit. It is true that there will be some who lose in the short run. In principle, the benefits to the nation are so great, potentially, that except for the difficulty of identifying the losers, in principle, it should be possible to provide some provision for those short-run losses. There's a lot of knowledge available in the world. This is perhaps one of the best or the most favorable implications of what we might call globalization. I think of an important aspect of globalization is that knowledge flows easily from one part of the world to other parts of the world. There are many things any country could learn from the rest of the world. They could adapt processes, they could adapt this knowledge to their country. Often that adaptation is not automatic, or it's hardly ever automatic. You usually need to combine the readily available knowledge with nation-specific innovative activity. But that's the kind of activity I think any nation should engage in. And I'm talking broadly about these issues. There are clearly nations where even if the knowledge about what are the best seeds to use under the best circumstances, given the nature of the soil in that country, and so on, such issues are part of what I think about as knowledge that would contribute to making that nation more efficient while it's embarking on a process of being a more highly industrialized nation. So I believe there was yeah. So I don't know if you're happy with that discussion of the missing page.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kydland. Yes, please.
Professor Kydland, as somebody who studied your models at extensive depth in graduate school, let me first say that it's a great pleasure and a privilege to have this opportunity to hear you listen and to hear you speak. My question pertains to the implications your work may have for the designs of institutions of fiscal policy. One of the lessons that we learned from the time inconsistency problem that you pointed out in the conduct of monetary policy was to design appropriate monetary institutions. The central bank independence is one example of that. I wonder what your work implies for the design of fiscal institutions, institutions of fiscal policy, which would automatically yield good fiscal outcomes year after year. What features you think help to attain that versus which don't? Thank you.
I think I don't have clear blueprints for what could be done. I think what the work implies is that it's even more important when in the context of fiscal institutions. It's even more important to think about them, to do research about them, and try to find solutions than it is in the case of monetary policy. You might say that we started with the easiest case. You make monetary policy as independent from the political process as you can. In the case of fiscal policy, it's hard to imagine that governments really want to give up the control of fiscal policy. I was at the conference in Costa Rica in end of October, arranged by the Copenhagen Consensus, to think about prioritizing what Latin America could do to improve development in their general region. And one of the things that was discussed was to create a government institution in charge of analyzing the effects of the fiscal policies being conducted and try to maintain the continuation across parties or across the leaders at a given point in time. It's clearly not so easy to do to make it work in practice, but I think any effort in that direction, or anything that today's smart, young and old economic researchers could come up with to try to find the right incentives in this situation would be very helpful. But all I can say is I think my work just emphasizes how important it is to really think hard about those issues.
Next question, please. Yes.
Professor Kydland, it's a small continuation to the previous question. I'm a student at AIN. Speaking about economic and fiscal reforms and deregulation, privatization in different countries, my question is it always a perceived loss of control on, say, public governance that prevents countries from adopting, say, forward-looking fiscal policies of tax cuts for multinational corporations? Speaking about closed economies, maybe China up until a few years ago was really closed, and not to say it was not very successful, but is it perceived loss of public governance? Is that one of the main reasons that prevents such economies from opening up? Thanks.
I haven't really studied the different nations close enough or broadly enough to answer the question so definitively. Much of what I know applies to particular regions, and there's no doubt that I know more about the region of Latin America than about any other region, all of South America and Middle America. Some of what I know I've learned from others. There's a very interesting article you may want to take a look at.